immediately turn this over to Michael Montgomery, who's going to moderate this panel. Michael?
Thanks, David. Hello, good morning. Dobro utro na svički. It's great to be here. It's great to be back in Sofia. John Harris says he was here 25 years ago as a reporter. I was here almost 33 years ago, November 1989, which is obviously a great time to be here. I met some amazing journalists who were incredibly generous, and it's really nice to meet some of you and hear about the great work you're doing. Also want to thank, of course, the America for Bulgaria Foundation and the World Press Institute for putting this all together. It's kind of amazing that it's come together, and I know it took a lot of hard work. I'm going to say a couple of things at the beginning. I'm going to introduce our esteemed panelists and ask a few questions, and then we'll get to your questions. So I know this is a hugely important topic for all of us. And we're painfully aware of the story. It's been going on for decades. John talked about it a bit. We know that for years, the media's business model, especially newspapers, relied on two things, largely advertising and paid circulation. The rise of the internet destroyed that business model. In the US at least, and some other countries, newspapers were the hardest hit. Profit margins narrowed, staff cuts, fewer resources for investigative reporting. However, not all the changes were bad. We've seen a proliferation of information easily accessible on the internet. There's sort of a democratization of information. As one of our panelists, Paul Steiger, has written, people with opinions who couldn't get a hearing under the old system could become their own publisher within minutes of buying a computer and getting connected to the web. We know there's a big downside to that as well. New media outlets emerged with innovative platforms and business models. We heard about Politico from John. It's 1,000 journalists. That's amazing. The COVID pandemic, as we all know, has only amplified this sort of good news, bad news paradox. According to a recent report from the European Federation of Journalists, news consumption has increased in some instances dramatically during the pandemic, but various lockdowns have caused a steep decrease in sales and advertising revenue for many media outlets across Europe. So, not only in these conditions do we have to consistently reinvent ourselves, but we all have to be super vigilant about sustaining ourselves financially. So, how to do that is what we're going to talk about. Let me introduce our panelists. To my left, Paul Steiger was the founding editor-in-chief, CEO, and president of ProPublica, which we've heard about. You probably all know their amazing work. From 2008 to 2012, and part-time executive chairman from 2013 to 2020. Paul served as the managing editor of the Wall Street Journal from 1991 to 2007 in some of its greatest glory years. That included 16 Pulitzer Prizes during that period. Galya, second over, is Galya Prokopieva. Yeah, she's the journalist and managing director of Economedia, one of the main media groups in Bulgaria. All of you from Bulgaria are familiar with that. Galya started her journalism career in 1993 when she joined the founding team of Capital Weekly, a leading Bulgarian newspaper. Since then, she has held various leadership roles at Economedia. And lastly, Camilla Bath is a journalist, editor, and media consultant based in South Africa. She explores new forms in storytelling in journalism and the media space with a special interest in podcasting. We're going to hear about that later. She helped bring to life several of South Africa's most recognized news podcasts and is just releasing a new series on the future, right? Is that what it's called?
It's called Future is an Attitude.
Future is an Attitude, great. So we're zeroing in on business models, revenue streams. Paul, I want to start with you. We just heard you went from the Wall Street Journal, a beacon of profit, capitalism, I don't know what else, and you went to ProPublica, a nonprofit model. I'm sure there's a long story about what that transition was like, but I'm curious if there's one thing that you felt distinguished those two worlds, especially that's relevant for this audience here. What would you say? I mean, you were running news, so in some ways it was the same, I suppose. But moving to the nonprofit space after so many years at the Journal, What was that like?
Well, first of all, and thank you, Michael, very much. It was very fortuitous. The timing couldn't have been better. You just described the hammering that legacy media, even very successful legacy media, was taking when I retired. I was 65 in the year 2007. The Wall Street Journal was looking at major cuts to staff, maybe a 30% cut in staff, maybe a 30% cut in budget. Instead, of course, Rupert Murdoch and News Corporation acquired the Journal, and he put money into it rather than having to cut it. And the Journal's doing very, very well now. But the print newspaper industry, which had for my previous 25 years, and it had been very successful financially, was strangling. And being in a position to launch a new not-for-profit publication with a relatively few new ideas, but with strong, deep pockets in our principal financiers, Herman Marion Sandler, who had started from a very modest middle-class background in New York, and came to California and bought a little three-store savings and loan, and a couple of decades later sold it for 25 B for Boy $billion, of which they had 10%, and they wanted to give the rest of it away, and were prepared to give $10 million a year to investigative journalism, which I was interested in doing. I had the good fortune to recruit 2 genius collaborators, and we had a tremendous advantage. I could recruit people from the Washington Post, one of the landmark publications, because I could offer them as certainly as much security as the Post could for their salaries.
You had the resources to match
Had
the
the
Post with salaries.
resources to do it, and then additionally, we had people coming into, I don't know, the name Sam Zell probably doesn't mean much to, well, you're from Chicago, so he was a successful commercial real estate entrepreneur, but a bully. He would do things like drive his motorcycle through the door of a building to go to a meeting, and he acquired, using financial legerdemain, using the newspaper company's own pensions, basically, to finance his takeover of the Tribune Times Mirror company that included the Los Angeles Times. And he went into their Washington bureau and cursed at them, said they were overpaid. The result was we could hire 5 star reporters, all of whom are still with us in senior positions. So it was a terrific time to be embarking on a nonprofit model, and there are positives of the for-profit side, but there are positives on the nonprofit side, and we've been able to at ProPublica exploit the positives on the nonprofit side.
And I think obviously people here especially would be a little wary of a wealthy individual buying a publication or starting a news organization, or a couple in this case. But obviously, you had huge firewalls and the same kind of setup you would have had at the Journal in terms of...
Not only that, the Sandlers and Herb was the most implacable on this. He totally agreed in the principle that I was to be the judge of who we hired and what they wrote. And he and his wife would give us guidance on finance and management and that sort of thing. And over the course of ProPublica's growth, we would, get, and people who were on the board or gave us money had, they could recommend a story idea, but it had to go to either to me or my top deputy. Could not go to reporters because the reporters would be intimidated, and they would not know whether their idea was accepted until they saw it published. And if one of us got enthusiastic at a board meeting or something like that, talking about a story we had done, and then started to say, and there's this follow-up story, and he would go like this and say, you can't tell me about that.
And so, I want to get into this in a minute. I want to go to the other panelists first. Obviously, you moved beyond the Sandlers as your source of funding. You've diversified that, and it's something that I think people are going to want to hear about.
Tremendous diversification.
Right. Galya, I want to go to you. It's one thing to talk about the media scene in New York, where you have an outfit like ProPublica that can literally buy the most talented, not buy, sorry, hire the best journalists.
Seduce.
But it is a bidding war. Anyway, you have gotten some of the best, and we've seen just tremendous journalism coming out of ProPublica. Obviously, it's different in a place like Bulgaria. The market's different. The reach of your journalism in terms of the Bulgarian language is obviously not global. Well, there might be Bulgarians around the world, but it's not as large as the English language. I'm interested in what specific ideas, business ideas, have you found most helpful in your experiences in journalism? Thinking of this, long transition since 1989. I'm curious about that, and which ideas connect with the kinds of things ProPublica has been experimenting with.
Thank you. Hello, good morning. Well, it's a very different place, of course, but surprisingly, and not surprisingly that much, I can share very similar experiences like the ones just shared here, because Capital, let's say it's the closest of Capital is to call it the Economist or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times of Bulgaria. So we joined journalism quite late for the glorious years, but we do catch 15 of the glorious years, and Capital was a very extremely successful story, very well known and established economics and financial paper, very well respected, great revenues, a well respected and happy journalist, independent, great storytelling and journalism. And this went for some 15 years. We were awarded 2 or 3 times the brand of the year. And then it happened to us what happened to everybody else in the industry. Titanic hit the iceberg. Mm-hmm. It was sometimes 2001 when we were establishing, after Capital, we established Dnevnik as a more broader general newspaper at that time, broadsheet. The very wrong time to establish a general newspaper, broadsheet. We had to change everything later. So the next 15 years, I joined the first team of Capital. It was a startup at that time of 10 people. I was 19 years old, and the average age was somewhere there, 20, 21. And I've been working as a reporter. Then I went into investigations. We were focused mostly in financial investigations, as we were business publications. So that brought us to corruption stories and frauds, and we've been dealing with fraudsters since then. It's not a very pleasant thing. But there's a value in it, and I will speak about. And then the next 15 years, we had to sustain what we have already achieved, and because we saw the value of it to the society, and we couldn't just abandon it. So it was abandon it. So it was very difficult, I must say, because first it was the digital transition, and first we had to teach our newsroom to embrace digital and to work differently, to go from the broadsheet and the paper to online and to be adequate to the audiences and etc. And this is a task by itself. It's not easy. It's not easy. And you have to invest in it while at the same time you're getting tiny and tiny of resources because the revenue streams were broken the same way as everywhere around the world. And secondly, we had to think of ways to sustain and to develop new business lines and to create startups a little within the organization. And then and this meant that the managerial capacity had to split between many things. I mean, do you preserve journalism and think of new ways of storytelling, or you're trying to do this? And we established a conference line, which was, by the way, very successful. And this was one of the strong legs to support us through the next decade.
Conferences.
Yes, business to business. We are, in fact, #1 business to business conference organizer in the country. 2020 was not a good news for us in that sense. And it was, we will not go into details, but it was extremely difficult. Just to add on a very intense institutional and political pressure. It were not good years for the democracy in Bulgaria as well, and we were paying all around the place. So we had to endure, apart from the economic hardship, also a severe pressure. I mean, anything you can imagine: prosecutions, tax inspections, regulators' inspections, fines, lawsuits, threats, you name it. So it was great fun, and it was very important. 3 things. It was first, somehow the team and the journalists were there, and they stayed, and they saw the sense of it, and the core team is still there. Secondly, it was very important that the shareholders supported it at certain moments. It was critical. And it was extremely important also the support of Bulgaria Foundation, which we had during those years as well. It wasn't the biggest chunk of the revenue, but it was very critical. Also, the moral support and for the standards we were standing for, etc. So, I always wanted to be a journalist. I, for the time being, ended up managing an enterprise, media enterprise, which is not the better part of the experience, I must say. And after all these transitions and looking to where the revenues will come from and who our customer is, be the reader or the advertiser, and we were a bit. Now I can say that I am optimistic. I believe in journalism, and I am very certain it will find a way in public service journalism as well. I'm very certain it will find ways to exist with dignity. Why is that? But going back to the basic principles of doing business, we should ask ourselves whether journalism brings value to anyone. And yes, it does. It does. Journalism brings values first to the readers because it keeps them informed to know what's happening in the world so that they can form their opinions and take decisions in life. And secondly, journalism brings value to the societies, protecting them from abusing power, standing behind certain values. And thirdly, as a side effect, journalism creates audiences. And when it's a good journalism, this audience trusts the media. So as a side effect, it has a potential to monetize also through advertising, one or another way. So somewhere there lies the business model of journalism, I believe. I mean, if it's the readers, they should pay. And they started paying, and we see very successful subscriptions models already emerging here and there. If it's the society should find a way to support public service journalism, because not advertisers are willing to support investigative reporting team, I can tell you. They are steering away of it. So if it's the society, the beneficiary of journalism, then the society will find ways to support journalism. And Bulgaria is a country still in transition, very weak institutions in progress, let's say, of emerging. And during these years, there were not institutions to support us, but then America had this institution. But I see also European Union trying to raise the topic of networks which will support and how journalism and how they will work and how to structure the financing. And I believe that if part of the answer is subscriptions, another part will be donations in one or another form. And thirdly, advertising is here to stay. It was display advertising back in times. Now it's the branded content. You can call it anyway, but it's more one and the same thing. It's a marketing message which is brought to the public through the audience which trusts the medium. So there are different, just a few. You may choose one model out of this. ProPublica is one thing. Politico have chosen another model through the branded content. We are here in a very small pond and a very small market. And we are somehow obliged to run the three of those in order to have the whole picture. And this is what we do currently.
So the main pillars in terms of revenue, or as you said, are advertising, conferences, and subscriptions.
Subscriptions, yes.
So
and donations.
And donations.
To certain
And that's
things.
something you're going to try to do more of. Small donations, not like the Sandlers giving you
Yeah,
$10
the
million.
society here is not ready to donate yet, but it will get there slowly. I believe in that. Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, I come from a public radio world, public radio, not government-funded public radio in the United States, which has been for years largely funded by donations, small donations from listeners. And it's a remarkable model that's got its challenges, but it's been incredibly successful. And if you've been in the United States and listened to public radio, national public radio, all of the different local stations, it's really something to be proud of. And I know it's been hard for some organizations to adopt that successfully, donations from listeners, but everyone's trying it, or some version of that might give you special benefits. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yes, in fact, we are running the two models now. So Dnevnik is the general news website currently, and its revenues are based still only on advertising and branded content lately. And it's starting to work. I don't know how sustainable it is because advertising is the big unknown. While Capital, being specialized and focused in economics and business issues, runs subscriptions and once again branded content and conferences. So we are running the two business models, and we will see which one will prevail.
And I wanted to ask earlier, I mean, how big is Economedia? I mean, how many employees?
150 employees altogether, down from 300 before the last crisis. It shrank twice in the last years, but I think we managed to sustain I mean, we are growing the audiences ever since, and we are sustaining the respect, and somehow our journalism and our teams were extremely important through the dark ages in the last 10 years. So we despite shrinking, it works, yeah, in this size.
And you're an optimist.
It's quite big for Bulgaria, by the way. We are probably having one among the biggest newsrooms in the country, right, which is the hard part to sustain, but also it gives thoroughness to our effort, because there are also niche players, there are smaller websites, etc. But there are times when this is like a strategic infrastructure to have journalists who are there on the spot. They can see it and they can report on what happened.
That's great. Camilla, so you are also from a country in transition since the early 90s, a different kind of transition. You're not only a journalist, but you've done a lot of consulting work, and not just in South Africa, but around the African continent. So I'm curious, in terms of trends, not the bad trends, but the good trends. What are you seeing similar things? I mean, are you seeing similar experiments, and particularly in countries that, you know, there aren't a lot of resources, might not be a huge market. Talk about that a little bit, and also I know you've worked in the commercial sector as well, and tried to create bridges there. Talk about all that.
So, Michael, I think the point to start here is probably to say that, yeah, in South Africa we have a saying that we use a lot, that is same but different, right? So things are the same, but they're also quite different. And this goes for South Africa and more so for the African continent as a whole. So Africa's media industry has always been severely underfunded. You know, for the most part, budgets have been extremely tight. They've only got tighter over the years, but there hasn't been a sort of a cornucopia of media funding on the continent. You know, certainly for as long as I've been in the business, budgets have been an issue. And yes, they've been shrinking over the years. But something interesting to remember about the African continent is that, I mean, as we stand at the moment, around 60% of Africans still don't have access to the internet. And so our traditional forms of media have actually, our traditional media platforms have actually been quite protected over the last 2 decades in ways perhaps that more developed economies haven't. The traditional radio and television platforms, and to some extent in some countries, newspaper platforms, have managed to thrive and in some places grow over the last 20 years. However, the enormous digital revolution, if you will, that's currently underway is really sweeping through Africa, like perhaps it did in other places 10 or 15 years ago. So we're now at a point where we're starting to see that really profound change in business models and in revenue. The traditional ad model, which has served us well until now, is truly starting to fail. And so what you're starting to see in Africa is a real push to innovate, to go multi-platform, and to search for multiple revenue streams that can sustain businesses. So we're not looking in Africa so much to make loads of money off media. There are some who are able to do it quite successfully, but for the most part, certainly on the continent, it's more of a battle for survival. I mean, if you talk to journalists on the ground, I was training a group of journalists from Nigeria a little earlier this year, and they were explaining how they often don't have the money to get transport to go to a government briefing. And how does one square that off? So the government department that's hosting the briefing will offer them transport money and say, here's some money for you to get to our press briefing. But the ethical concerns and the professional concerns that come with that are so difficult and so limiting that journalists are very often stuck between a rock and a hard place. So you mentioned that we need... we're already working with really limited resources in Africa, and so part of the challenge in Africa is how do we implement change, how do we generate revenue that can sustain our businesses, how do we innovate, but in ways that cost little to no money at all. And it's a very exciting place to be. There are some organizations in Africa who are really trying to embrace that, but at the same time, that tension of keeping the news going is an incredibly difficult one to navigate.
So, and just touch on your work that has moved into the commercial sector or private companies, and how you've tried to create connections for revenue with news organizations.
Sure. So one area in which, certainly in South Africa, there is opportunity for revenue is around branded content. So I look at it almost as a necessary evil. To be able to do the journalism that we want to do, sometimes we have to work with partners in ways that in no way undermine our credibility or affect our independence, or potentially break the trust of our audiences, because that's really the key. And so what I've been doing, I mean, the podcast I've been working on in the last little while is a branded podcast affiliated to a global automotive brand. And the production costs of the podcast are sponsored, right? They're covered by the company. But we still get to do great, meaningful journalism around a topic that's vital for people to understand, which is the future, and specifically in South Africa, how the Fourth Industrial Revolution might change the way that we live and work and move. A few years ago, I was involved in a very similar podcast project that was sponsored by a medical aid company, looking at South Africans doing things in new and innovative and exciting ways in the world of work, and how the world of work is changing. And again, that allowed us to get really stuck into a topic that is valuable and has real news value. And yet we were able to get sponsorship for that, and earn money that allowed us to do more of the investigative or meaningful journalism around it as well.
Okay, so I'm curious about that. So a lot of us listen to podcasts, are going to hear more about podcasts soon this afternoon. But so when you say, so you basically, you'll hear a message at some point in the podcast promoting their brand, like an ad. In exchange for that, they're gonna, and they're the only sponsor for the podcast. And
Correct,
for that,
yeah.
they're gonna support all the production or a lot of the production.
Well, for the two projects I mentioned specifically, all of the production. There are hybrid models as well.
And it's not based on your audience size. Like you'll know on YouTube or some podcasts, you'll get paid more depending on how many downloads you get. But that's not this model.
No, that's so what this brand is doing is affiliating itself with a media house that has great clout. So the podcast is affiliated to, the latest one is affiliated to an independent radio station in South Africa. It's one of the premier talk radio stations, and I worked there for 17 years, called Talk Radio 702. And the brand essentially partners with the media house to create the sponsored content. Obviously, the content is aligned to their values as well as ours, and their mission as well as ours, but there's a real symbiosis there that can develop. And the exposure that the brand gets by being affiliated to this production is really where the value lies for the brand. And the value for us is that we get the resources to do it.
And wait, one last question on that. I'm interested. But the topic helps. This is a topic about the future. This is not a investigative report about, I don't know, arms sales by the South African government.
Yeah, so to me, branded content and sponsored content is a very specific area. It's not... brands are not going to want to affiliate themselves with bad news. They're not going to want to affiliate themselves with hard-hitting investigative journalism for the most part. So the sponsorship and branding opportunities are not a one-size-fits-all solution. It's a part of the solution, but it's not the solution.
Yeah, I mean, we see it in the U.S. There's 60 Minutes, our premier investigative TV show, gets plenty of advertisers. They don't shy away generally, but it can be hard. We're getting questions already, and I want to get folks here ready to ask some questions. I want to ask one other thing, that one trend. It's not so much a business trend, but it's helped share resources, which has just been a lot more collaborations in the U.S. ProPublica and my organization, Reveal, have set up local connections with local news organizations where we might bring in some reporting resources, data, share that. Sometimes there's cost sharing. And Paul, I mean, ProPublica's been big on that. Your local, what's it, Local
Reporting Network.
That's right. And that has been a huge trend in the US. It's given small organizations, which are often really on the ropes, struggling. It's given them a boost. It's given them the opportunity to work with, some of the best reporters in the country. And has that involved? That's involved some resource sharing, funding sharing.
Funding sharing, with very small exceptions, we don't have revenue, but we have raised, I say we, my successors have raised substantial amounts of money because it's a very successful process. I mean, it started with just a few relationships, and then the donors wanted to double it and triple it. So I think that there are now 21 per year, 21 different news organizations that ProPublica is collaborating with in various ways, such as the ones you described, around the country.
And is there anything relevant for Bulgaria in that, Galya? I mean, collaborations, pooling resources, joint fundraising, I don't know, joint revenue making?
Yes, there are some attempts, and there is a local reporters network, which once again is supported by the Foundation America for Bulgaria. But once again, the scale matters, and you make a network when you have living parts of it. Here, the small towns are really small towns, and many local newspapers, they simply dropped out of the scene. But cooperation, I believe, is a key word for the future of journalism as well. I'll go in a slightly different direction, and I will comment on one of the biggest risks we fail and challenge is the technical risk, the technology. I mean, the way we do journalism, but at the same time, we have to run with the front runners in America and to learn how to make subscription models, how to go into e-commerce, because subscriptions is e-commerce by its sense, it's digital marketing. It's a completely different universe from doing journalism. And what I believe, and many media companies, smaller, bigger, they're trying to go through this, and they're falling more and more behind this technological divide to provide this journalism. And what I believe is the answer is the journalists, newsrooms have to focus on content and producing the content. And then we somehow have to share the burden of jumping this technological bridge. So for me, the place for cooperation is to share the knowledge, to share to democratize the digital tools, because there are such tools already developed, and it's a matter of how we give them to newsrooms and just leave journalists to do their work. This is the focus.
Excellent. I'm going to get to questions in the room. Encourage you to raise your hand. I do have a question that's come in online, and it's a good one for all of us. But the question is, how do readers in the US perceive institutionalized funding by big foundations? In Bulgaria, for instance, foreign foundations are still a huge donor for independent media, and this feeds accusations of dependency on foreign and private interests. And obviously, there's disinformation campaigns around that. I'm curious, Paul, ProPublica has diversified its funding, but there is a perception in the US, not about ProPublica, that many of the foundations who fund news nonprofits and investigative nonprofits are liberal institutions with very specific agendas in terms of policy, et cetera. It doesn't mean they have any influence on the news that's produced. But you do hear about that in some of the right-wing media. And so I'm curious about that, and also obviously in the Bulgarian context.
Well, for us, it has scale makes a huge difference. I mean, look, when I was at the Wall Street Journal, we would have a big company pull its advertising. But we had lots of other advertisers. So, we had a strong culture that said advertisers don't get to guide coverage. If they want to take their advertising away, that's their choice. We hope they come back. But in the meantime, we have other advertisers. Well, the same is true with donors. We started out with one very major donor that was like 90% of our budget, but now the Sandler Foundation, Herb and Marion have died, unfortunately, but their foundation still is a large supporter, but it's down to $2 million, and the total budget is close to $40 million a year, and including we've, as you noted earlier, we've stolen your small dollar approach. It now can be big enough for us that it's worth investing in the staff that runs the computers that keep hitting up people that have given us $20 to give us $25 and to give us their credit card numbers too.
I just want to, there's another question that I will paraphrase, which is basically, look, great, ProPublica is doing great work in the US. These are interesting things, but we're talking about a country that's much smaller markets. And this person's asking, what are some more specific ideas that would be, really relevant for the Bulgarian media scene that you haven't already touched on? Because I think this person's feeling like there's got to be something that would be more tailored to the marketplace here.
Unfortunately, the smaller the marketplace, the less solutions are around. I don't know how to help this question, in fact, except for on choosing a focus of what you do. In a country like Bulgaria, to have a broader journalistic organization like ours it's a very difficult task to sustain. But then, and we see our colleagues doing this, they decide to make some niche solutions and to have a niche website focused on one topic. And this might work, this works. And I want to go back to the previous question about influence, and this is something since the beginning of journalism, it has always been a question. But for us, if the question comes from Bulgaria, our revenue at the end of the day is very diversified because we having different revenue streams on one hand, and then within those streams also the different advertisers and different kinds of support. And so basically there is no single very big influence except of us, ourselves in this. And secondly, one can very soon see and sense whether media is biased or heavily influenced by a certain interest. That's very easy to be seen. And that's my answer to this question. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's go to some questions in the room. Anyone have anything to ask? Got more flowing in from, yes, please.
This is probably a loaded question that Galya would appreciate as such, but it's probably a good one for Ms. Barth as well. In this country in particular, the national media outlet reporting is very Sophia-centric. Most of the national reach newspapers or television stations tend to cover the political developments in Sofia and tend to neglect whatever's going on in the countryside, particularly smaller communities, small-sized towns or small village concentrations. My question is, how do you solve, if at all possible, this issue of a media which is a national media but tends to be big city-centric, in our case Sofia-centric, but I'm sure in South Africa, Pretoria or Johannesburg-centric. And then you go out in the countryside to these little communities or rather small-sized towns that never see the light of day, metaphorically speaking. I'm sure there could be similarities between South Africa and Bulgaria. to a degree, it's relevant in the United States as well, but not that much, because the network there is, the system there is completely different, and local stations and local media are very strong compared to Bulgaria, in particular. So I'd be really interested to find out what you think about this.
So, yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon, and it's a really fascinating question. In South Africa, you're absolutely right. We actually have two centers of focus. One is the economic capital of the country, which is Johannesburg, and Pretoria as part of a greater megacity, and Pretoria being the seat of government. But then we also have the legislative capital of Cape Town, which is where our parliament operates from. So you have our two biggest cities being the biggest focuses. And you know, I think, sometimes miss the opportunity to connect with people in more rural communities or in smaller towns and cities. For instance, I was involved in the launch of South Africa's newest independent television station in 2019, and I've had some ongoing involvement with them as well. And when we launched, obviously the big drive was to get the viewer numbers up, right? And we had some really focused strategy sessions on how to do that. And as part of that, we looked at provincial breakdowns of numbers. And we worked out that there were some provinces in South Africa, some of the most populous provinces in South Africa, that were really underserved in terms of the audience, well, of the news share. And so we very strategically and very specifically made sure that we had reporters in 3 of the most underserved provinces, and made sure that we got daily contributions from that to the national network. And our numbers in those 3 provinces grew so much quicker than in the other, than in the bigger centres. The bigger centres eventually caught up, but it was as if you had communities that were saying, finally I'm seen, finally I'm heard, and now I'm going to be loyal to this brand, and I'm going to trust this brand, and I'm going to form a connection with this brand because they're reflecting me and my life and my struggles. And I think that's an incredibly powerful place to be. I will also say that with digital media, I mean, earlier there was the reference to how the barrier to entry in terms of publishing is virtually down to 0 these days, right? That is a huge bonus, and it's also a huge threat to us. But I think the advent of truly digital media and audience-first digital media also means that we have the opportunity potentially to go hyper-local and to serve communities that need information that helps them make better decisions. My rule for journalism is always, it boils down very simply to the idea that journalism makes people or helps people make better decisions in their lives. And if we can equip people with information that's relevant to them, then we're fulfilling that mandate on a whole new level.
Yeah, and I want to hear from all of you.
Well, let me just sort of talk about how we at ProPublica try to play both basketball and table tennis at the same time. You know, basketball stands for doing the big national stories, like the tremendous trove of Internal Revenue Service documents that some source, we have no idea who it was, but turned over to us the tax records of half the billionaires in America, and ProPublica reporters were able to delineate how much of their wealth was going to tax collections, whereas how much the writers of the tax laws would think would be going to their tax collection. They weren't paying anything near what most people would regard as their fair share. And in order to play in that pool, I'm mixing my metaphors here, but we have to have a legal structure. We have to have a ability to receive documents anonymously structure that is well-known and people understand how to use it. And there are a whole bunch of things that require, that you have to have in place to do a big story like that. At the same time, our local reporting network is geared to getting down in the localities by, first of all, once a year we put out a request for proposals, and they get like several hundred a year, of which they choose 20. I think it's now 21. And what ProPublica will provide to the projects that are deemed the most promising are, first of all, money to allow the reporter who's come up with the story to spend the whole year working on that story, but then his or her news organization can hire a substitute to come in and replace the spot news flow that reporter was going to do. Secondly, if there are skill sets that the local news organization doesn't have, whether it's data or various digital models, graphics, that sort of thing to support the story, specialized editing resources, we have the ability to provide that. But the important thing is that in that newsroom, there is the culture of, gosh, we can do a tougher story that really gets to what our readers care about. You know, we may not be able to do 5 of them a year, but we can do 1 of them a year. And it becomes part of the culture of the institution, where they have a goal of being able to do that. And they may collaborate with us on the next one, or they may collaborate with Michael on the next one, but it creates a culture of that kind of possibility that permeates the newsroom, and people say, look, we've been massacred by the hedge funds, but we still have enough people to do at least 1 of these a year.
I want to get to Galya on that question. I just wanted, in terms of the U.S., it has been a problem. I mean, 10 years ago, when newspapers were struggling, I mean, you had places like Sacramento, capital of California, you had agencies with billion-dollar budgets who hadn't seen a reporter in a year, you know? So a lot of those gaps have been filled by the nonprofits, but again, the revenue stream for that is small, and they tend to be getting money through, you know, larger organizations and funders. Galya, the urban-rural divide.
Yes, we recognized our Sofia centricity some time ago. And of course, we wanted to address it, but we also wanted to address it sustainably, because it's easy to open some local news offices, and then how to maintain them. And here the NGOs were very helpful. But in the last years, we started the project called Cities, and with Capital. So we started first with 3 or 4 places, 3 or 4 cities, where we wanted to go once a year with the team editorial and create a local small conference, and create a local once a time a booklet, a newspaper for the place, and meet the local entrepreneurs, because we cannot go and cover everybody everywhere. I mean, it's simply not possible. So we went through our main focus, which is the economically active people, entrepreneurs, businessmen. And it worked, because we were immediately the next year supported for the conference, even the magazines were heavily advertised by local people, and it worked, and we are expanding slowly. So we added more cities in the past years. And more journalists from the newsroom now are joining to those trips to spend time there, to do local reporting. And currently one of our leading editors, he just decided that he wants to to go into this heavily, and he wants to move to Plovdiv, which is the second largest city, but it's still already outside Sofia, and to head this division of cities and to also cooperate with the network of local journalists, and we are going to expand that. And it, for the time being, is also it's working, I mean, as a business model. But yes, we are not covering villages, remotes, and this is a different task. And so far, I can't see the model for us to do it.
I think one other thing that's important to mention here, and again, the increasing connectivity in the world is perhaps in this instance playing in our favor, is the crowdsourcing of information and citizen reporting. It comes with a great risk, especially in terms of editorial oversight. But one strategy we've found that has been very useful in South Africa is to develop relationships with citizens, with ordinary people, and ask them to do some of the legwork for us. We also create I mean, partnerships it's a very formal word, but we try to connect with local newsrooms on the ground in smaller communities and train journalists up to be able to provide us with the kind of information we need. And I think if we can mobilize people on the ground in those far-flung areas to be able to provide us with information that we need to perhaps cover a wider story or go in depth into something that we simply can't get to. There's an enormous value there in tapping into the local knowledge of people who are actually in those communities as well.
Okay, thanks. I'm afraid we're out of time. I have a lot more questions than I'm sure all of you do, but the conference will continue and there'll be other opportunities. But thank each of you, Paul, Galya, Camilla, very interesting and very helpful. And I'm going to hand things back to David.
Thank you. And thank you for this great panel. I'm going to let you guys take your seat. We have a guest appearance by the U.S. ambassador, so I'm going to let you sit down and give her the microphone, and then we'll dismiss for lunch. So, Ambassador.
Good afternoon. I just wanted to take a moment to say congratulations to the World Press Institute, to the Association of European Journalists, to America for Bulgaria Foundation, to all of you for organizing this really important event, especially in this unprecedented year. And I'm not talking about COVID. I'm talking about some troubling trends that we see around the world, which include rising authoritarianism. We see strengthening political extremism, and then, of course, eroding press freedoms around the world. And so the fact that you are all gathering to talk about these issues is extremely important. And I am excited to hear the session that you will do on Bulgaria, because press freedom in Bulgaria is one of the most challenging yet important issues for all of us to address, particularly the Bulgarians. We at the embassy have been focusing on this for a very long time, not only looking at training opportunities for journalists, but we've offered American experts, along with the Germans, American experts to help the Bulgarians as they revise their laws for public media, and that's really important for the funding and independence of public media. We do a lot of advocacy for journalists, particularly those who have been harassed. And then we highlight the importance of transparency in media ownership, because we all know that it's very, very important to know who exactly is running a particular media site, and that tells you a lot about the slant that those outlets have. So those are some of the things that we do, and again, I'm looking forward to the discussion that you will have tomorrow. And congratulations again to all of you for organizing this, and thank you, David, for being here.